I have been living on my own for around 3 months. It's the first time in my life that I had lived anywhere other than the home in which I grew up. My parents were somewhat divided over my departure. My father, in the classical sense, was happy for me. He gave me a pat on the back and congratulated me on taking charge with my life. My mother, on the other hand, was quite distraught over me leaving. When I was standing there, bags packed, ready to complete my move into my new apartment, she was a mess of tears. Her reaction was odd for me. It seemed like for the majority of my childhood, she couldn't wait for me to grow up and leave the nest. Now that the day had finally come, she seemed to regret those past feelings. Regardless, I loaded up the truck and moved into my very own apartment. The first week there was almost unbearable. Between work and school and unpacking, I was utterly overwhelmed. I'd work the early morning shift, come home, spend an hour or two unpacking, then spend the remainder of the day doing college courses online. At the end of the first month, I had unpacked pretty much everything I had brought with me, and I had a day off from work, so I was taking the time to refresh on past lessons when there was a sudden knock on my door. Wondering who could be coming to my place uninvited, I walked to the door and opened it. I was taken aback by what I saw when I opened the door. It was myself. My confused and shocked expression stared back at me. Before I could process what I was seeing, a voice chimed from behind my silent image, followed by a head peeking over the frame. It was my dad, carrying a large mirror of sorts. He asked me to give him a hand with it, and I absent-mindedly opened the door and helped him carry the large mirror inside. He stood there panting like crazy nearby before pointing and telling me to go help my mother. I'm not sure why he was panting so much. The mirror wasn't even that heavy. Just seemed like he didn't want to go back downstairs if you ask me. Once I reached the bottom of the steps and scanned the parking lot, I could see my mother waving frantically in the distance. I wandered over and she immediately began handing me box after box. Before I knew it, I was hauling 3 large boxes up my apartment stairs along with my mother. Once we were back inside my place, I finally found my voice and asked them why the sudden visit. My mom told me that they wanted to stop by and see how I was doing, also to give me some housewarming presents. She then proceeded to unpack all of the boxes we had carried up. Most of the boxes contained utility stuff, like kitchen items and toiletries. I opened one of the boxes, which were heavier than the rest, and they contained an assortment of tools. My dad chuckled and said, "Merry Christmas, bud." I couldn't help but laugh along as I thanked them both for the gifts. As I was laughing, my eyes drifted over to the mirror which rested against the wall in my hallway. I asked my mom where she got it, and before she could even answer, my father once again chimed in, saying that she found it in the sewer. She slapped him on the shoulder and told me that she found it in a thrift store in town. My dad, not one to waste an opportunity, shouted, "It's the same thing!" Before my mom could raise her hand again, he had already dashed his way into my kitchen. I thank them both once again for the gifts, and for stopping by to see me. After they left, I finished my schoolwork for the day. It was late in the evening when I completed my work. I walked out into my living room and stopped as I passed by the mirror. I stared at it for a bit, before lifting it up and hauling it into my bedroom. After eating a late night snack and watching some TV, it was finally time for me to head off to bed. As I laid there, a random bout of insomnia began to creep into my mind. I tossed and turned in my bed, but I was unable to get comfortable. I rolled onto my side, trying desperately to fall asleep. I opened my eyes, and in the darkness, I could see my reflection in the mirror. I stared mindlessly at myself, and my reflection did the same. Bored, I raised an arm straight into the air. My reflection followed. I waved. It waved back. I dropped my arm, and my exhausted eyes shot open as my reflection held its arm in the air for a few moments longer. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes once again, my reflection was just simply staring back at me. I chalked it up to my extreme fatigue, so I just rolled over and tried once again to go back to sleep. The next morning when I woke up, I tiredly glanced over at my mirror. When I did, I thought I saw my reflection smiling at me while I laid there. There was no smile on my face, and after briefly refocusing my gaze, I saw that my reflection was normal once again too. I got out of bed, showered, and left for work. That night after I had gotten home from work, I sat on my bed with my laptop getting some courses finished for school. Every time there was a brief pause in my work, I'd glance over at my mirror to make sure everything was fine. I went to bed without issue sometime later. The entire second month I lived in that apartment was completely uneventful. Life seemed to pass by me in a flash. Then, at the start of my third month there, something creepy started happening with my mirror. One night, as I was lying on my side as usual trying to go to sleep, I felt a chill run up my spine as the feeling of something watching loomed behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw my mirror resting innocently against the wall. Something was off about it that made my pulse quicken. My reflection was laying on the bed, but was completely facing towards the mirror, looking at me, even though my physical body was turned away from the mirror. This wasn't possible, and seeing this freaked me out. As my pulse thumped in my ears, it began to pound louder and louder as I watched my reflection slowly begin to sit itself up onto my bed. My own expression was one of shock and worry, while the reflection in the mirror was filled with sadistic joy. I jumped up from my bed and turned on the lights, and in a flash, my reflection was back to normal. My rapid pulse didn't subside until I grabbed the mirror and moved it into my hallway. It was difficult to go to sleep after that, but somehow I managed. The following day, I got ready as usual and made my way to work. When I got home, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The mirror which I had moved was no longer in my hallway. I opened my bedroom door and there it was, resting innocently in its previous spot. I searched my entire apartment, then called my parents, asking if either of them had stopped by. I had given my parents a spare key, so I thought they might have, though they both denied coming over. Upon hearing that, I rushed into my bedroom, grabbed the mirror, and shut it into my spare room. That night, not long after falling asleep, I was awoken to the light sound of a single knock. I sat up rapidly, looking around my darkened room. In my stupor, it was hard to tell if I had really heard the sound or if it had just been a dream. As I waited for a moment listening, I heard nothing. I laid back down, and right before my eyes shut, I opened them once more. I had seen it briefly when I first sat up. My body trembled as I turned my head and saw the mirror in the same spot as before. Only this time, my reflection was now standing in the mirror, watching me with a darkened grin. I jumped up and turned on my lights once more, looking back at the mirror. I was expecting it to go back to normal, but it didn't. My reflection was still standing in the mirror watching me. He simply raised an arm and pointed at me. This look of malice crawled over his face, a look I had never made before in my life. Blood began pouring out of my reflection's eyes and nose, while numerous cuts began to cover his body. Though he looked unfazed by this, I could feel the tension in the room rising. Then, suddenly, the lights in my room went out. This sent a jolt throughout my body and I panicked, running out of my apartment, down the stairs, got in my car and drove to my parents' house. They were both confused by my sudden desire to come home for a little while, but they let me in regardless. That happened yesterday. Today, I had gotten a call from my apartment complex, telling me that there had been complaints about someone running around in my apartment at night. Today, they sent someone from management to investigate. And when they opened the door to my apartment, they found nobody there. What they did find was shards of broken mirror leading from the hallway to my bedroom. They assumed someone had broken into my place and had damaged some of my stuff. They advised me to call the police and file a report. I almost dropped my phone when they said that. I desperately wanted to tell them that nobody had broken into my place. But something might have just broken out.